Anyway, I want to thank my panelists who are here with me today. This is going to be an exciting conversation. We've all heard about decarbonization, right? But not so much about carbon removal. And carbon removal is basically what to do when the carbon is already in our atmosphere. Well, we need to get it out, say experts. And it's big business. The carbon offsets sector surged past $1 billion this year. So we have here two people who have their finger on the pulse of this industry, Jeff and Brennan. And so I'm very excited to find out more. So Brennan, please tell me a bit about yourself and Patch.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much, everyone, for having us. My name is Brennan Spellacy. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of a company called Patch. And we build software to enable primarily corporates to access environmental markets. Environmental markets are essentially one subset of that are the voluntary carbon market, which is exactly what we're talking about today. That's how you actually buy and sell the ability to sequester carbon dioxide. Before starting Patch, we're about a 2-year-old business headquartered in San Francisco. I worked at a variety of technology startups across Shopify and Sonder and studied chemical engineering at McGill.
Nice. Nice university, too. Jeff, you're here representing Andreessen Horowitz. Why have you guys ventured into this sector? What do you see there?
Part of venture is you're trying to figure out what the future is. You're always trying to bet on the future. The last panel was Web3. There are a lot of really smart people who think and don't think that that'll be part of the future. The mega trend suggests that climate mitigation is a trend that we have to take seriously. I've been investing with that as part of the thesis in a lot of what I've done in Silicon Valley, particularly around asset utilization models like Airbnb and Chef and Neighbor and others that are redeploying existing assets and getting higher utilization out of them to the benefit of the asset owners and the people working it. I look at Patch and the appeal is bringing that same marketplace dynamic to a very nascent but potentially large two-sided marketplace.
So Jeff's firm has been behind some of the biggest household names that we have here now. Airbnb, you mentioned, I think, Lyft, and a couple of others. So it's very interesting when people watch you to see what your next move is. So it's very interesting that you have invested in Patch. I just wanted to give some stats on the importance of carbon removal. So the National Academy of Sciences shows that carbon removal is critical, for example, to the United States reaching its Paris climate goals in terms of lowering emissions. The United States would need to remove about 2 gigatons of CO2 per year by mid-century to reach its goal, and that's about 30% of the U.S.'s 2019 greenhouse gas emissions. This is to give you a sense of what is needed here. And so therefore, that's also why carbon offsets is very important, because the world can't reach the goals without both decarbonization, so when we lower emissions, and when we try to offset or neutralize what's already in the atmosphere. Can you tell us, Brennan, something about the carbon removal projects that you're involved in, and who's your ideal client?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the highest level, it's important to understand that Patch is primarily a software business. And so as a result, we're not actually operating these carbon sequestration facilities ourselves. These are their own primarily private entities. And there's 8 or 9 major chemical pathways you can actually sequester carbon dioxide with, whether that's something as familiar as storing it in biomass, for something like reforestation or kelp growth. That's typically referred to as a short carbon cycle. Short in this context refers to maybe 100 to 200 years. That's how long the CO2 stays out of the atmosphere. And then there are more human-engineered solutions, things like direct air capture, or this process called enhanced weathering, which is all about sucking the CO2 out of the air and running it through some sort of reagent or solvent such that the CO2 will never re-enter the atmosphere. And that's on the time scale of 10,000 years. And so we work with all these different types of organizations to help them commercialize and scale their business. So as far as the ideal customer, for us, it's really any tech-enabled organization that cares about the climate, which is, at this pace, almost everybody. Now, of course, investors push you to focus, and so you have specific sectors you focus on. And so for us, it's primarily banking, banking and fintech companies like Afterpay use Patch. We actually do a lot of Web3 work as well, where companies that are using some sort of proof of work blockchain are actually understanding what the carbon intensity of that blockchain actually is and then compensating with Patch. And then actually like traditional capital allocators, like private equity firms. So EQT, for example, who's made a net zero commitment for 2030, is managing their entire carbon credit portfolio on Patch, both for their firm, but as well as for their portfolio, which they have around 100 billion AUM. So like the scale of kind of leverage you can get with a software solution like Patch is quite immense. And historically, you would need a very large sustainability team in order to kind of have that type of impact. Now you can do it in an afternoon.
You sound like a one-stop shop.
So we are not a one-stop shop in the case where we don't do footprinting.
Okay.
And that's actually something that's really important. There's, we mentioned this number, 1 billion earlier. So in order to actually hit our climate goals, it's like a 10 gigaton number for the globe, right? So about 20% for the US, because we're a very high emitting nation. That's going to result in around $500 billion worth of spend at the lower end per year. That's a massive amount of GMV. It's good in kind of the Andreessen future, right? That's what gets folks excited. But you have to think about incentives in that world, right? And you might not be operating with kind of a bad incentive structure in mind in the short term, but you really have to, we always think about what happens if you add 1 or 2 zeros, and is there something funky that could happen? Footprinting is actually one critical piece of that puzzle that we don't want to touch because of the incentive structure. And the reason for that is you're essentially prescribing the sickness and one of the solutions at the same time. And so if we are monetizing based off of throughput, like most marketplaces do, right? If we're also telling people how much they should be compensating in the first place, we're technically incentivized to say you should actually not decarbonize at all and completely compensate. Now, that's what Brennan as an individual does not want. But if you have 1,000, 10,000 person organization, these kind of incentives gonna sometimes take a mind of their own. And so you have to make sure you address them structurally early on, because it's very hard to unwind in the future. So basically anyone doing some sort of carbon footprinting exercise, if they're monetizing compensation or vice versa, that should be setting alarm bells off in your mind.
Okay, so before you go to Patch, have a sense of how big the problem is, what is it you need to actually remove or offset. Makes sense. This question is both for Jeff and Brennan. So almost over the years, carbon removal has, when experts talk about it, they've often talked about the challenges, either technological or cost challenges or just logistical challenges of essentially engaging in a form of, and I'm making this up, any scientists here don't be mad at me, but terraforming, like how do you suck something out of the atmosphere?
Yeah.
It's quite complicated. So please tell me what's happened now, what's changed where carbon removal seems more feasible?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I can speak from the chemistry perspective, and you can provide the asset manager kind of lens. So I think for us, I think there's kind of 2 pieces. The first is most things, especially when it comes to sustainability or any like new type of energy source, were really difficult to start with, right? The cost per kilowatt hour from a photovoltaic or a solar panel 20 years ago was 4 orders of magnitude larger than it is today. And at some point, there just has to be a certain level of conviction that something needs to get done where you can put a huge amount of capital towards a particular problem to drive down a particular cost curve. So historically, there just actually wasn't that much appetite to truly almost use the human will to reverse kind of this kind of difficult thermodynamic problem, which is taking this low density gas in the atmosphere and pulling it back down, right? It's much easier to not burn fuel at all than it is to reverse that process. And so folks were primarily focused on that problem. The issue is that we didn't address that problem fast enough. And now we're in this situation where we cannot simply just reduce our way out of this problem. And so what's actually changed is literally a little bit less around specific technological innovation, although that has changed as well. It's actually more just the amount of appetite and capital that's prepared to be put on the line to traverse that cost curve.
Now, I live in California. I've lived in the same town for 25 years. In the last 3 years, we have had the 3 worst fire years ever, including one period 2 years ago when we were trapped in our house for 3 weeks, prepared to evacuate for 10 days, and with the air outside at 400 to 600 AQI, the scale stopped at 400. And so, it's just, for the scientists for ages have been calling for what's going to happen. The models say this is going to happen. It turns out the models undershot what is actually happening, the scientists now believe. And, we had our fire insurance canceled. And by the way, we live 6 minutes from Sand Hill Road. So the epicenter of the venture ecosystem. So this is not a remote problem. It's just kind of come home. And so that time when we were buried in the house, we said, okay, we got to get out of here. We went to a place in Montana. Their AQU was 300 from the smoke from the California fire. And you're just kind of like, this is increasingly not becoming an abstract concept. And it's one that, we think is, the bad news is it's a monster problem. The good news is they're really smart people trying to address it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I always find it interesting to have a personal note on basically how climate is affecting, people on an everyday level. Sorry about that.
Ours is a first world problem. We were talking about your not first world problem earlier. Yeah.
So I always bring up, my family is from developing South, and many countries in the developing South, of course, will suffer the consequences of climate change sometimes at a more severe level, often at a more severe level, and have less capital to mitigate those effects. So, I find it interesting that we're talking about this, and of course, the different technologies and the capital going in to solve this problem. Another thing about carbon offsets is that lately in the news, we've seen some headlines talking about greenwashing in that industry. I'm not going to go into all the specifics. It had nothing to do with patch, but just in general, what goes on in the industry. And so I wanted to ask you, how can the sector maintain, investor confidence and the public's confidence, and make sure that essentially these incidences of greenwashing don't stick to the industry as a reputational issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think one of the largest drivers, and for context, for those who don't know what greenwashing is, it's essentially some sort of corporate making a sustainability claim that maybe isn't as robustly backed up by science or by action as maybe they initially let on. So I actually believe the first kind of key to this problem before address greenwashing systemically is setting better expectations with kind of whatever parties are involved. And what I mean by that is when we've actually engaged specific corporates who have had greenwashing claims brought against them, we've actually realized that in many cases it's actually just due to their ignorance and not really realizing that there was a misset expectation between what a particular provider or supplier was doing, what the corporate thought was happening, and then what they actually communicated to their end stakeholders. And so first and foremost, the kind of base of the pyramid, and this is what we spent a lot of time at Patch doing, and this is kind of the value of marketplaces in general, is basically aggregating information and standardizing the presentation of it. This is all about driving both liquidity but also transparency within a particular ecosystem. Because until you can understand what are you actually buying, why does it cost something, where is it actually happening, how do the flow of funds work, it's very easy to get caught in a situation where, in some cases, it wasn't even malintent. People just didn't even understand what they were doing, or maybe what they were doing was not as effective as what they could have been doing. Mm-hmm. So base of the pyramid is actually understanding what are you actually getting, right? And then the idea of, many of these greenwashing claims typically come down to, I believe some fast fashion organizations get flack for, sustainable materials or lack thereof, or a very small element composed of it. The way to break that down is saying, well, what percent of that particular SKU or good is sustainable versus not, right? If you actually said 1% is sustainable, you might not make as much of a marketing splash,
So basically disclose it.
It disclose it, essentially. It's all about disclosure. It's making sure people understand what they actually are buying.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I love the digital marketplace model, and I've applied it in, alternative accommodations, alternative food sources, things like that. Patch is a digital marketplace from my perspective, and what digital marketplaces done well can do is things like trust and safety. Take someone else's authentication layer and make it transparent. Price discovery. What is the real value of what is being sold to the person who's buying, and how do those signals go over time? So done right, a marketplace takes what historically have been inefficient and or opaque markets and shines lights on them. And that light can often be very helpful. When I was operating at eBay, the way the collectors collected prior to eBay was the guy who wrote the first venture check used to drive around Michigan looking for a specific duck call, I think it is, by an artist named Oscar Peterson. And he, in the pitch, he went on and typed in Oscar Peterson and found 4 online, even though eBay was incredibly early. That kind of transparency, that kind of trust and safety that's built into the system is what made eBay work, so it's what makes Airbnb work, and ideally it's what makes Patch work.
Thanks for that. This is just by way of giving some context to this question and also the follow-up. You may be aware that in the UK they have passed enhanced climate disclosure regulations as of April, and their companies will be asked to have a third-party auditor actually look at some of the claims. And in the United States, I should double-check on Canada, but sure, not far behind, or are they there? But in the U.S., the SEC is already looking on enhancing, climate disclosures for companies. So, just out of curiosity, because in the potential U.S. rules, companies will have to disclose the amount of carbon reduction represented by the offset and information about the source of the offset. So, I'm just interested in how could Patch help them stay compliant? Like, what can they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the core bread and butter. And Lucy Hargreaves, who leads public policy for Patch, is actually here with us today as well. That's actually the whole idea behind us engaging federal governments for the most part. Is actually we want, it's actually ironic for a private software business to say this, but we actually want more regulation in some cases because it's actually, there is a lot of gray. And thinking about the incentive structure piece, if we have to self-regulate or provide guidance, that's one, a lot of liability for a small organization, and 2, we might not always get it right because we're not seeing the full picture. And so actually bringing in regulators to the table early is something that we're really excited about. And we actually just want to be the force multiplier, if you will. Regulators are really great at setting up frameworks. In some cases, they're weaker on execution. That's what software is really, really good at. So how do we make sure the Patch platform is spitting out information that regulators want to consume and in a format they want to consume? So that's actually, even now, we're spending time on that. It's making sure when these regs pass in both the UK, or once they've already passed and get implemented in the UK, and once they finally get passed in the US, anyone on Patch is compliant from day one. And that's kind of what the success scenario looks like for us.
That's good to know. Anything to add there?
Nope.
So stepping back and just taking a macro view, this question is to both of you. So what needs to be done to make climate action a good investment with solid returns? And I just say this as a former energy reporter. Experts look at, for example, investments in the fossil fuel industry, and they still yield a higher return than, say, for example, in the renewable industry. This is just as a comparison. So is that a challenge for climate investments,
right.
or?
So the V1 of climate investing in Silicon Valley when I was there was largely large hardware products. The Salvaterra, just things that both had the enhanced execution risk of hardware plus monstrous capital requirements. And I mean, capital requirements that are just hard to fathom in the startup world because, we have very organized pools of capital that enter at different stages. Very few software companies historically were funded with multi-billion dollars. Very few venture companies were funded with multi-billion dollars. So that gen of climate basically didn't work, and there are a lot of funds that had pretty awful returns chasing that. So everyone ran from the sector. Now, but what didn't go away is the problem still there. And I wrote a blog post a little while ago saying there are no bad ideas, only bad timing. The market is back now, the needs much greater, and the approaches are much more software oriented, which is much more consistent with the venture capital model. The capital needs of Patch, we hope, are not what Salvaterra needed to go through. And so we think this time's different, but we bet speculatively in the future. So we'll see.
Okay, well, thanks. It's not easy, but you're in there.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself doing some more deals in the climate industry in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, we won't do we're not set up to do the super technical stuff. There is some fascinating projects going on alternative cements and alternative construction and things like that just are kind of have more science class than I'm personally comfortable for. But we think there's a layer of software businesses that have to be built that are complementary to Patch and do all parts of the value chain, like accounting, like authentication, like tick down the list. Moody's agency to rate different projects and things like that. So we're enjoying getting deeper.
Okay. Now, we haven't talked about this so much, but I almost always ask this last question, which is if there's a policy or a business initiative that could be helpful for you in your industry, what is that? What could that be?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the biggest piece for us, and Jeff was actually alluding it to before, which is actually this idea of credit rating agencies effectively are actually evaluating the underlying project. So there's still not enough scientific participation, although there is already a lot. But when you think about the scale of this problem, like when you have to scale, like add 2 zeros to a particular market, like you need a lot of effort. And the idea when we talk about incentives, that's also something patchers want to get into, which is evaluating the underlying projects. Again, if we make money off of throughput, we're incentivized at scale to say everything is good. So we'll never touch that. We'll always integrate with people who are evaluating that. And right now, today, there are actually very, very few private organizations. I can only think of about 3 off the top of my head in this space right now. Now, I know that the kind of traditional S&Ps of the world, et cetera, are beginning to think about this, but we need way more energy in this space. And the reason for that is the number of chemical pathways being developed is actually far outpacing the number of credit rating and evaluators. So if you have a direct air carbon capture business or enhanced weathering business, right now there is actually no truly specialized rating agency for those types of projects. And so if you think about this problem where we have to try 1,000 things, 100 are going to work and 10 are going to scale, you need a bunch of that verification support to kind of complement the ecosystem. So that's the piece that, if I had a wish list and 10 of these companies cropped up overnight, I'd be really excited to work with them all and make it easy for our buyers to understand what's going on.
And my 10 seconds are we have to price externalities. You just can't. A lot of what the SEC does, I'm not sure of. That is one they will get right, and the UK is out in advance. You have to price the externalities, or it's free.
Yeah, makes sense. Put your money where your mouth is. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.